chart that shows 2019 support at the national level. On the left-hand side is percent support, ANC 57.5, DA 20.8, EFF 10.8. On the right-hand side, how that translates into seats in the National Assembly. Now, the paper that Adriaan refers to first starts sketching out the situation in South Africa at the moment and in 2022. The 30 ANC regional conferences, the provincial conferences, the National Policy Conference, and the Zondo Commission that will keep the ANC in the spotlight. So we have a situation of ongoing disunity in the ANC, intra-party violence, the RET onslaught on Ramaphosa continues, and this all heads to the 55th elective conference. And at the top is sort of just a summary of the state of the ANC. Well, it should be 2022, not 2021. It's the largest party, and that's important not to forget. But it has a large urban stay-away vote, and its support base is increasingly becoming more traditionalist and rural. Weak leadership, factionalism, lack of accountability, corruption, poor service delivery, and consumed by infighting. The opposition is also struggling. They can't capitalize on the urban black voters that are disaffected. The DA is under threat of becoming a regional party. The EFF is possibly at a ceiling. It's still too early to pronounce on Action SA, and we don't know if we are going to see an IFP resurgence. So all of this comes together in December, when the ANC will elect a new top six and National Executive Council. So the first two scenarios, called Bafana Bafana and Tuma Mina, are really about a win for the Ramaphosa faction. The first, the Bafana Bafana, most likely scenario, and that I'm going to spend the most time on, is really where it's sort of more of the same, ongoing factionalism and slow action. The Tumamina scenario is a decisive win for the CR22 faction, Cyril Ramaphosa's faction, and that he is able to consolidate his power base to the extent that the RET faction splinters off, or a few of them leave, and that the ANC revitalizes. So let's start off by looking at the Bafana Bafana. Before I start on the Bafana Bafana scenario, the other two scenarios are much more unlikely. It's a win for the RET faction. So on the one scenario, nation divided, the ANC remains united, but it dramatically loses support. The Mandela Magic scenario is where the RET faction wins, and Ramaphosa eventually leads a breakaway. And you see an entire reconfiguration of South African politics. Remember, scenarios are there to frame our discussion, they're not a prediction. So I'm going to firstly talk and spend a bit of time just on Bafana Bafana. So Bafana Bafana, as I said, is where Ramaphosa wins, but the ANC, it's sort of more of the same. Ongoing factionalism and slow action, ongoing decline for the party in the 2024 elections. It needs alliances in Gauteng and KwaZulu to remain in government. But it is the largest party. IFP grows in KwaZulu. Action SA becomes a national party, 2029. Now the ANC needs a national coalition partner. And exactly who that is will determine South Africa's future. And it needs alliances in Gauteng, KZN, Free State, Northern Cape, and Northwest. So this is the national forecast for support at national level in the Bafana Bafana most likely scenario going forward. ANC about 48% in 2024 and 43% in 2029. DA 22% in 2024, 25%, and so on. You see, Action SA grows to a national party, 6 and 8%. So, most important, what's going to happen in Gauteng? Not that I know, but this is what the scenario tells us. So what this chart shows is the provincial forecast for Gauteng. Firstly, on the left hand is the 2019, the current situation, then the 2024 forecast, 2029 forecast on the right-hand side. For interest sake, I've put in what the results of the local government elections are. So the ANC drops from 50 to 42 and eventually 37%. The DA sort of holds on to its own, but the new kid in the block, Action SA, does significantly better in Gauteng, 14, 16%, and it becomes a power broker. EFF and the DA struggle because they lose support to Action SA. This is provincial results for 2019. So the Gauteng results reflect what I showed you a little bit earlier. Remember that at the moment, the ANC has just got 50% in Gauteng. And you can see the situation in the rest of the country, the political support for each province. So in the Bafana Bafana forecast, this then looks like as follows for 2024. Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, there, if the ANC should stay in power, it needs coalition partners. Most likely Natal, the IFP, and Gauteng, it's a question of whether it's going to be the DA or the EFF. If it is the EFF, the ANC support will plummet, no doubt. This is what the situation will look like in 2029. Now you can see that a number of provinces, Northern Cape, Northwest, Free State, and KwaZulu-Natal, are no longer governed by coalition politics, with all the associated implications for this. So just look at how that changes from 2019 to 2024 to 2029. This is what happens at local government elections. 2011, 2016, history, the two left-hand columns. 2021 is the most recent local government elections. And then on the right-hand side, 2026 is the Bafana Bafana election forecast. So the ANC goes from 46% of local government support to about 38%. DA retains, EFF retains, but of course, the one that grows is Action SA, as well as the independents, which is going to become a much larger factor in South Africa's politics. So I've spoken about the Bafana Bafana scenario, and I spent a bit of time on that. I'm very briefly going to touch on the much less likely Tumamina scenario now. This is where Cyril again wins, but he now has a decisive win. And the ANC basically is dominated by the Ramaphosa faction. So he wins decisively. The RET faction splinters off, maybe joins the EFF, and the ANC revitalizes. So you see a resurgence in ANC support. It retains national majority in Gauteng and so on. And that's the results of Tumamina in 2024 and 2029, where you see the ANC retaining 51% and 53%. Other parties struggle, including Action SA. So the next two scenarios, I'm going very briefly, nation divided, which is very unlikely that the RET faction wins. This is probably only possible if Ramaphosa himself steps back from as presidential candidate because of accusations of party funding being used, as the public protector would have us believe. So nation divided is where the RET faction wins, the ANC remains united, but it loses support dramatically. You have all kinds of complex governing coalitions. So that's sort of what the forecast at national level, 2024 and 2029 looks like. ANC support goes from its current levels to 36% in 2024 and 28% in 2029. The DA grows, Action SA grows. And particularly your independents grow. EFF remains at a ceiling. The last scenario, Mandela Magic, which the name comes from basically the recapturing of the spirit of inclusiveness that Mandela and former Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke away, where what happens is that the RET faction wins, mostly probably because Ramaphosa does not stand as a candidate, and he then leads a breakaway. And now many would say that this is not in the character of the president, but we will see. He leads a breakaway party, and that enters into a governing coalition with the DA, Action SA, and so on and so forth. And the ANC RET faction, what is left of the ANC, really struggles. So this is the forecast on that. We see a dramatic decline in ANC support. You see that others now includes the new Ramaphosa party, which enters into an alliance with the Action SA, the DA, to form a governing coalition. In this scenario, South Africa in 2024 is governed by a new coalition of opposition parties, and the ANC, possibly in alliance with the EFF, is the official opposition. So that's the scenarios. A few final remarks, Adriaan. Just, there's been lots of discussion about the president saying business creates jobs, sort of a statement of the obvious. But of course, just to re-underline the point that it's not possible to redistribute our way to prosperity. We need sustained and rapid economic growth, and we need that for several decades if we are going to alleviate the challenges. The Bafana growth forecast that we model is about 2.4% out till 2029. That's mediocre. We need much more than that. A high growth strategy requires political change and government to step away from land reform without compensation, including its partnership with traditional leaders in former homelands, if you are going to unlock poverty alleviation in the former homeland areas, because you need to change land ownership patterns. You need a clear distinction between state and party, the pursuit of an inclusive approach to South Africa's economy and politics, stability and investment-friendly politics, and our forecast shows that South Africa is steadily falling behind its peers. So in this graph, what we do is we show, this is South Africa. This is from 1990 until 2030, and we look at GDP per capita for South Africa versus other upper middle income countries globally. So you can see how we are more or less stagnant. But in 1990, our GDP per capita was 168%. Almost 70% higher than the average for other upper middle income countries. We are now in about 71% of that, and we will, on the Bafana growth forecast, get to about 53% by 2030. That is not a scenario that alleviates poverty, inequality, and provides jobs. So there's been a lot about the security concerns, and this year certainly is going to be a difficult year given the Sandy Africa report. But I mean, we all know by now that the security sector is in a crisis, and it's in a crisis because of bad management, because of cadre deployment, factionalism, and incoherence between the police, within the police, and so on. And you have a distracted government party engaged in internal battles with little implementation of the numerous recommendations that have come. And instead of fixing our current security agencies, what we do is we have a new border management agency that's going to cost a lot of money and provide lots of jobs to sort of new incoming faction. And the reality is we can change this. If we look at how government acted under COVID and the turnaround in SARS, it shows us that the extent to which South Africa can turn things around if we really decide we want to. So what we need to do, it's my last slide, we need to insulate the security agencies from political interference. Need competent leadership in permanent positions. This has been promised very often, but it doesn't happen because political change is coming. We need to have security agencies that will survive any political change. And politicians that respect the division between political oversight and management. And of course, I'm referring here to the police in particular. We need a rationalization of our resources. We spend a significant amount on security in South Africa, particularly on police. Police have more money. Their underspend last year, 45 billion rand, was the equivalent of the entire budget of the national, the NPA. The test is that no matter which party governs, the senior security staff should not be under threat. So Adriaan, thanks very much. That's sort of a summary of the paper, and I'll again share the link in the chat function.
Thank you very much, Jakkie. That is indeed a mouthful, lots to digest there. So let's try to eat the elephant bit by bit. Mpumelelo, Lindiwe, as our fellow panelists, let me ask you both to make some introductory remarks in response to Jakkie's presentation. Lindiwe, can I ask you to start responding to Jakkie's 4 scenarios for 2024, if you agree with them, if you see maybe a 5th or a 6th scenario, and just your kind of high-level feedback on what you've seen. If you can just unmute yourself and go. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adriaan, and thanks again for the invitation to today's panel. I shared this during the the sort of meeting we had earlier to discuss this, and it's something I've been thinking about a great deal ever since, that I very much agree with the broad strokes of your analysis, Jakkie, particularly with regard to the options within the ANC, although the more optimistic ones I'm less convinced by. But I do think that we are entering a phase in South Africa's politics where the way we analyze who will govern and what the likely formations of government are going to be has to change. And what's great is that we have a blueprint for this already in the local government elections. I like to think about scenarios in elections, first of all, not in terms of who will get what percentage. I find that to be unhelpful. I prefer to think about trend lines. What is the trend looking like for each political party, and how likely are those trend lines to intersect in such a way that parties with mutual interests can form governments? So I want to offer an alternative framing for largely what Jakkie has put forward, which is that there are two scenarios that we have to consider. The first is the eThekwini Metro municipality example. That is an example in which the ANC gets below 50%, but enough to form a government with the support of one or two or a few very, very small political parties. Of course, in Durban, this was Abantu Batu Congress, an offshoot of the NFP, an offshoot of the ANC, and so on and so forth, and the IFP. Just a very, very small political party, 0.7% of the vote in the local elections. And the key about mayoral elections is there's a difference between voting in a mayor and voting a budget. Voting a mayor is, secret ballots, rules can be broken and so on and so forth. But when you're passing budgets, you require political party buy-in at the collective level, right? Members are under the party whip. So Durban formed a government primarily because the opposition couldn't do two things. It couldn't find a credible candidate for mayor. Ironically, the DA didn't field a candidate for mayor in Durban, and so simply put forward its caucus leader, a caucus leader with whom very few outsiders were familiar, and with whom the party itself had not put forward as a mayoral candidate. So why were they doing it now? And this resulted in the opposition failing to get a totality of support for an opposition coalition government and the ANC picking them off. That's scenario number one. It's the most realistic scenario for 2024. The ANC will fall below 50%. We have to get right with that. It's going to happen. But when it does, it will either fall enough below 50% that it cannot credibly form a government because there are not enough parties that will get behind it, or it'll fall just below 50% and be able to sort of pick off the very small political parties. The latter is the eThekwini scenario. The second is Johannesburg. Right? The opposition is able to unite behind a credible candidate for mayor who had a credible election campaign, a very public one, somebody whose background is in local government, was part of the government of Herman Mashaba, who is a leader in her own rights, outside of politics, and who's a realistic prospect for governing the city of Johannesburg. That is a broader coalition, naturally. Any opposition coalition is going to be broader and more complex than a coalition led by the ANC. And of course, in Joburg, it's four parties, the DA, Action SA, COPE, and the ACDP. There's some infighting, especially with respect to the other Gauteng metros, Ekurhuleni in particular, and that's to do with passing budgets, which is very different to electing a mayor. You can defect as an individual in the election of a mayor. You can't do that when it comes to the party whip on budgets. And the same is true of Parliament. Parliament elects the president, but the president still has to pass laws and budgets in order to do her work or do his work. And so that requires strong leadership from the head of the government, but also from the political parties that form part of that government. Strong leadership, management of ego, management of self-esteem, and the ability to move past conflict and get things done in the interests of, I think it's a worthwhile objective, showing that there's an alternative to the ANC, keeping the ANC out of government. Not because, that is an end unto itself, but because South Africa needs to see what alternative government looks like. I suspect if we have a Johannesburg scenario in 2024, which is less likely, of course, there's going to be a lot of court fighting from the ANC. The party will fight relentlessly to get control back. And so the more likely scenario, unless the opposition, which is notoriously fractured and unable to unite behind a single leader, unless the opposition parties can come and form a minority government, the more likely scenario is the eThekwini one, in which the ANC, having fallen below 50%, is able to pick off smaller opposition parties and get them to join cabinet, either with cabinet posts, patronage, etc. That is the more likely scenario. But that doesn't mean that things can't move to a Johannesburg scenario in 2029. Let me stop there, and I think I'll talk a little bit more about the detail of both scenarios once Mpumelelo has had a chance to speak.
Thanks, Lindiwe. Mpumelelo, I would like to ask you to unmute and share with us your top-level feedback on Jackie's scenarios and also what you've heard from Lindiwe. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriaan. It will be interesting to know how Jakkie came up with these names. It's Madiba, Tumamin, and Bafana. It's quite something. Anyway, my preliminary thoughts, Adriaan, are this, that I think a lot of these scenarios, obviously, as Jakkie puts it, it's just, frameworks within which we can think about future possibilities. But there's a lot of, caveats, a lot of factors upon which these scenarios would depend for them to become reality. One of them would be the voter turnout. We saw how that factor can be so influential. The mood of the voters, regardless of what we as experts sit here and think of the political parties, but the mood of the voters at that time and the context that shaped that mood can have a huge impact. I think Davis Coles did some studies that show what happens if there's a voter turnout is extremely high, and what happens if it's moderate, and what happens if it's extremely low, as we've had now during the municipal election. So that it's a big factor. The second factor we have to think about is the socialization, what I can call the political socialization among the opposition parties that at the moment have formed various coalition governments around the country in municipalities. At the beginning, we can see that there's a lot of fracturing and there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of point scoring because they're all trying to establish themselves in the eyes of the electorate as the primary drivers of what needs to happen. So whether it's Action SA, DA, it's all they're trying to get some some audience with the viewers to create positive perception of themselves. But between now and 2024. There is a possibility that as they work together, as they grow along, two things might happen. They might learn to work with one another and reduce the friction and then increase the trust factor, which then builds up and gives voters more confidence to help them maybe, to be trusted a little bit better come 2024. Or it may go completely worse, like the friction becomes so worse that this coalition becomes so disintegrated and voters are disgruntled with these people that have tried to vote into power to replace the ANC, but they've not lived up to expectation. So socialization can go positive, it can go also negative. So to follow Lindiwe's example, she used the Durban Metro. I want to use the Cape Town Metro, for example, how we came to be where we are now with the situation in Cape Town. So it started at some point, the ANC was very dominant. At some point, it was coalition with the National Party and the ANC. At some point, there was a ramshackle coalition government headed by Helen Zille with all kinds of characters. Badi Chaban, I think he's late now, and many other. It was a very ramshackle coalition, but it transitioned to something else. It transitioned to where the DA became a dominant party. So the question now with the other municipalities, Johannesburg, Tshwane, Eguruleni, and other smaller towns, is these coalition arrangements, will they ultimately lead to something that can emerge, that can be a dominant or a party that voters prior to 2024 can trust and say we're gonna vote this party? So there's a lot of permutations that might change the scenarios or amend the scenarios. We may have a completely different scenario. But I agree that the Bafana scenario looks more likely at this stage. The other scenario of CR 2022 breaking away. I mean, Jakkie, that's like growing a pineapple in the moon or something. It's really unlikely to happen. But Bafana is more likely. However, there's also that real possibility. Within that scenario of Bafana, there are two possible scenarios. One is the Lindiwe scenario where she says a small party can come in and govern with the ANC. There's also the real possibility that might not happen, then which allows the other opposition parties to come together to form a national coalition government. But that's dependent on the socialization factor that must happen between now and then in the current municipal coalitions.
Thanks, Mpumelelo. Jakkie, I want to come back to you. Coalition seems to be our future. I mean, whichever way you come from. I think the one thing you all agree with, if I may, is that the ANC is very likely to dip under 50% in 2024, which means we will have a coalition government.
Yeah.
The past two rounds of local government elections has shown us that the opposition parties in 2016 in Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay, and again now in Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni Tshwane, and not Nelson Mandela Bay this time, the opposition parties had that anti-ANC drive that was part of their campaign. Let's just get the ANC out at all costs, you know, and that seems to be one of the almost only things that brings them together, the likes of the DA and the EFF specifically. I mean, if you had to take into consideration what happened in 2016 and 2019 again, 2021, I'm talking a few months ago when the EFF threw their lot behind the DA candidates in all the local municipalities. And the ANC then goes, let's say they go up to 45, 46% in 2024. Isn't there a likely scenario that the DA, the EFF, the Action SA, and the others may try to put together some kind of coalition, you know, and you get water affairs and you get police and you get arts and culture and there's something for everyone, which could be a very unstable 5 years, which almost wants to ask me, shouldn't we be more careful what we wish for?
Yeah, no, in one sense, very true, Adriaan, but I think the much more likely, in my view, is that the ANC will have to choose one of the larger parties to partner with, and that choice is going to be absolutely critical. I think after 2024, it's probably unlikely, but I think that choice becomes almost inescapable for the ANC after 2029. So the question is, will it be the DA? Will it be the EFF? Will it be perhaps Action SA if it managed to get a national and become a truly national party? And the attraction of that influence, because there's no other party in South Africa beyond the ANC that can get to that level of support. And that's, I think, so my best guess is that the most likely future coalition is going to be between the ANC and the DA. And I think that when you look at the signs what DA politicians are saying, it is, in a sense, also where, let's call it the reformist camp within the ANC want to go, because that's where the economic future and so on lies. So I don't think it's easy to displace the ANC, and it will be able to attract whomever. And will those opposition parties, is it more likely that we're going to see a coalition between the DA, the EFF, and Action SA? I think the EFF is a very unlikely partner for any of the other parties, except for the RET faction within the ANC. So I think that in actual fact, much more like what we need in South Africa is we need a stable growth coalition. And in my view, a stable growth coalition, I've written about this before, is probably does not include the EFF.
Lindiwe, the DA's federal chair, Helen Zille, has been writing and talking about the realignment of politics for many years. It's a topic that's now very mainstream debate at the moment of how our politics will realign. But it also feels to me that in the DA you have this, the realignment, let's call them the realignment faction or school of thought. People would be open to something like that. But you have a leader in John Steenhuisen who says time after time that there's absolutely no chance that he will work with the ANC. And I mean, that's almost become his own slogan. I mean, how do you reflect to Jakkie's view that there could be a toenadering in 2024 on ideological, maybe free market business grounds between the parties?
Yeah, I'm willing to put some pretty good money behind the bet that will absolutely never happen. It may be the right thing for South Africa, but that's not what animates political parties when they're making these kinds of decisions. I know that's what we elect them to do.
That's very true.
They think about two things. They think about their survival, and they think about the likelihood that they can govern well enough to be returned to office after the next polls. The country usually comes third. And I know we want to live in a world in which that's not the reality, but it is. And I want to get back to something that Mpumi said earlier about the city of Cape Town, which is so apposite. But listen, Jakkie, it would be better for South Africa to have a broad coalition, you know, like the Germans, when the socialists and the conservatives come together and they have like 70% together and they govern and it's stable. That would be great for South Africa. Would be bad for the smaller party that joins that coalition. Same as the Liberal Democrats in the UK. They would lose their so-called identity and the bigger party would be buoyed back into the mainstream on the back of the party that moderated its excesses. This is moderation of its excesses, you know. So it would be good for the DA. It would be good for South Africa. It would not be good for the, it would be good for the ANC. It would be good for South Africa. It would not be good for the DA. So that's the first thing. Let me say also that I know for a fact, you know, political egos are very fragile things. John Steenhuisen would love to be a cabinet minister. He has said as much on television, right? Helen Zille, who launched the project of the sort of the realignment of politics. First of all, it's a very different thing now to what it was when she first mooted it. When she first mooted it, and I fully supported this, it was, can the DA be the center or the leader of the next national government in South Africa? In other words, can it be the biggest minority party in a scenario in which the ANC has fallen below 50%? This is the election, 2024, where that sort of dream should have become reality. But what has Helen Zille led the DA to do in the aftermath of Mmusi Maimane's departure? To become a smaller, more ideologically pure read, you know, you can read that racially, and certainly I do, political party that is like a moderating influence on the ruling party, as opposed to the center of a national government. Those are two fundamentally different visions. And the latter is a vision in which certain leaders in the DA see themselves in cabinet. And they've decided they can't win a majority, but they'd still like cabinet seats. And so this is the way they think they'll get them. But it's not going to happen. It's not in the ANC's political interest to partner with its rivals like that. And even if it would benefit the party by invigorating it, it's also not in the DA's benefit, because its backers would be like, you've spent your entire career fighting this party and now you've given them power. It's not going to happen. But I won't lie, there are secret wishes in the DA, certainly, that, you know, certain people at the top of that party can make it into cabinet. But I don't see that happening. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is, what Mpumi said about the city of Cape Town is so important. We mustn't forget, this is not the DA's first local government in Johannesburg. It governed in 2016. Why did that same trajectory that happened in the city of Cape Town not take place in Johannesburg? In other words, why was the DA not able to grow in Johannesburg sufficiently to be getting closer and closer with every election to governing as a majority party in the city of Johannesburg? And I think the answer lies in exactly what I alluded to earlier, that the change of direction under the current leadership is not towards majority and governance. It is towards being a bit part player in a majority, either led by the ANC or led by other organizations, in order to retain the so-called ideological purity. And you can read that in any number of other, you know, ways. I mean, I think one of the things we don't do enough in South Africa is do the same kind of RET analysis that we do of the ANC in parties like the DA and the EFF. If I asked anyone on this panel, and sure, Mpumi, you've thought more about this maybe than any of us, and you, Adriaan, as well, sorry, being journalists, but like, what are the factions in the EFF? What are the factions in the growing Freedom Front Plus? Does anyone know? What are the interests of those factions? We know they exist, they have to. And how are those factions pulling and pushing against each other to make political parties think critically and sometimes not so critically about what decisions they have to take? So I would argue the DA is not growing is a consequence of its current leadership, changing its decisions or its mind about where it wants to be. Also, sometimes you lose elections, you lose support, and you say, oh, no, I wanted to do that all the time. That was my intention, right? Sometimes things happen and you, what they call in television series, you retcon it. You do a retroactive continuity, whereby you say, that's what we planned, all along. We're coming back to our roots. That's the narrative at the moment. So is it because of failure or is it a choice? Who knows? Last thing. We don't yet have a language in South Africa for what a coalition government is. We've all been using the term as though we understand each other, but I don't think we do. Is a coalition the group of individuals who elect a mayor or a premier or a president? Because the systems are all identical. Is a coalition a group of political parties that all vote in the same way on every issue on the basis of a set of values that they've agreed upon as part of a coalition agreement? Is it confidence and supply, where a political party says, we won't join you in the government, but we will sit in the opposition benches and vote your program of action into office? Or is it a full coalition deal where those opposition parties are not only voting the government's plan of action, but they form part of the government? In other words, they have cabinet seats. So there's just multiple ways in which the word coalition has meaning. And I think because we've borrowed the term from countries that coalition govern all the time, we haven't taken enough time to interrogate what it means. So a coalition government can form on the basis of a party, like in Durban, getting 41% and adding a 0.7% party. It's still less than 50%, but it's enough votes to get the mayorship through. There's still another hurdle, which is you've got to pass a budget, right? And you've got to pass other legislation that enables the program of action that you have set for yourself. And what does that 5 years look like if, for example, as you say, Adriaan, multiple political parties, all of them in cabinet, all of them with different value sets, all decide to govern together, and they fall out? Does the government fall? Does it get reformed? Is it a small government that gets confidence and supply? We need to unpack the meaning of coalition, and we need to unpack the meaning of coalition instability. And lastly, we need to not consider the job done just because a mayor or a president or a premier has been elected into office.
Lots of good points. Thanks, Lindiwe. Mpumelelo, I want to talk about the small parties with you because for many years, we almost, had a bit of a chuckle at these kind of like 1%, 2%, 3% parties in parliament, the likes of the ACDP, COPE, UDM. They've been struggling along and, they sometimes form coalitions on a number of issues. But if you have a scenario in 2024, and then as Jakkie predicts, certainly in 2029, where 3 or 4 or 5 and definitely 7 or 8% becomes absolutely key, where you can be the kingmaker. I mean, you can decide cabinet, you can call the shots, you can make demands. Suddenly we're in a new world for a party like Inkatha Freedom Party, certainly for Action SA, very likely for the ACDP and the UDM. And then we have these new kids on the block. Action SA is the most prominent of the lot with Herman Mashaba as the leader, who scored an unprecedented 16% in Johannesburg in their first election and took away, I thought, votes from very significant pockets of electorate in the northern suburbs of Johannesburg and from Soweto. But you also have people like Songezo Zibi, the former editor and thinker who's now started the Rivonia Circle and told my colleague James de Villiers last week that a political party is not something that he's not thinking about. You have former Chief Justice Mogoeng last night on his interview with JJ Tabani saying that the God will still tell him what to do, but there is a plan. And there's apparently lots of kind of right evangelists to the right lobbying Mogoeng to become a religious type leader in the country. You have Musi Maimani's One South Africa movement that has so far said that they are not entering formal politics, but who knows? There's still a few months left. And then you have someone in this conversation who recently changed the name of her organization to Futurelect. Mpumelelo, small parties, do you think it is becoming cool again? Do you think smaller parties will be more interesting and that you no longer need even 10 or 20% to be a major player in mainstream politics. You can, with your 5, 6 or 7%, have a big impact on our future.
I must say, on a lighter note, I think Lindiwe is like Cyril Ramaphosa. They won't launch their parties. They're very conservative individuals and very shy. But you know, Adriaan, on a serious note, it's a very important question, but I'll tell you what I've observed. If you look at the trends since we became a democracy, you'll realize that voters are very excited when there's something new that comes up. So if you look at, for example, when the UDM was formed and contested elections in 1999, I remember that time I was still a university student studying political science at TEFLOP, and Holomisa came there. He was so popular with the students, and he was a very popular figure. And I think that maybe it was partly because of the context within which he was fired from the ANC, because he was fired for basically exposing corruption and for refusing to retract that a cabinet minister had been involved in corruption. Also because he had become very popular as a person among the homeland leaders who gave the ANC a lot of support in terms of military training and other resources. When they came back from exile, a lot of them settled well in South Africa to a great extent because of his contribution. So he was very popular. But the moment he broke away from the ANC, there was that excitement that there was something new. And think about it. At that time, the ANC was still very popular as well. We had not seen the kind of sins that they've committed now. So they were still like a pure party, some angels there. So, but still, Holomisa managed to capture the imagination of a lot of people working with Roof Mayor. So the second thing that happened in our short history as a democracy is that when there was this COPE breakaway of Musiwa Lekota and Bazima Shilowa, once again, South Africans got excited about this COPE thing and all of that, bringing a new dimension into politics. And they voted it with enthusiasm. If you look at the votes that Holomisa got the first time he contested, and you look at the votes that COPE got the first time they contested. And the third was when the EFF, for the first time, contested. Again, a lot of enthusiasm about this new political party. And each time all of these parties contested, they did shake the ANC a little bit. And for me, it says something about the voters, that voters are looking for something new. But the second point I want to make is let's look at the other small parties that you're talking about. Since they've been formed, some of them, like Holomisa, Patricia de Lille at some point came to the picture with ID before it became good after she left the DA. And then you look at the Freedom Front Plus and all of them. There's a dominant factor about them that makes them not to grow after the first excitement. It's that they're conservative. They knew the leader becomes the party and they're conservative. They don't want to be challenged. In the beginning, you need a strong leader to form a party and to set up the rules. So you need a little bit of a dictatorial tendencies to make the party stable and to build the institutional culture of the party, right? Obviously using the popularity or the personality of the leader. But at some point, a successful leader will be judged on the basis of having been able to build the party as an institution that can live without him or her. So a lot of them have not been able to do that. Holomisa has not been able to do that. De Lille didn't, well, her party was not really old when she folded into the DA, but she didn't manage to grow the party that could outgrow her. If you look at ACDP, we only know ACDP cannot measure as the only leader. The IFP managed to change its leader only recently. So what they do, these parties, is that they stifle that excitement that they brought in the beginning, and they forget that the excitement must be renewed all the time to give the voters a sense that, you know, things are going to happen. And that's where, by the way, to the credit of the ANC has been very good at continuously giving people some excitement that something new is about to happen. As we complain about Cyril Ramaphosa being slow, you know, taking time to take decisions and all of that, some guy will emerge, having looked at Ramaphosa's weaknesses and say, listen here, I'm a guy who can take decisions at a split second. I don't need to create a huge imperial presidency for me to take decisions. And then this guy is going to come as the new figure in the ANC. Of course, it won't be long before we realize he also can't do anything. But at least they keep voters imagining that something new is about to happen. Think about the kind of excitement that Zuma generated among ANC diehards who believe that this is the guy to save us from the Sussex pipe-smoking Thabo Mbeki, who's an intellectual who speaks to himself and his few inner circle. So Zuma said, well, I'm the consultative guy, I'm your ordinary guy. So the point here is that political parties don't generate the type of excitement. And let me go to the DA. Lindiwe spoke a lot about the DA. The dimension about the DA is that the DA has been good at electing. They've changed leaders, right? They moved from Helen to Musi. Before Helen it was Tony Leon, and now they've got John Steenhuisen. But there's a problem there in the DA. As the DA tries to renew and elect new leaders, there's an old current that wants to remain, and it stifles the party from getting that excitement that is necessary. So an old leader comes back and says, there's something wrong with this party, I want to rescue. But hang on a bit, you are old. I don't mean in terms of being ageist. I'm talking about in terms of having been in the party for too long. Tony Leon allowed Helen to move with the DA. And to her credit, she did a lot of work to build up the DA. But then when she's supposed to leave the DA to get the new excitement to build up on her excitement, she hangs on to it. She wants to control my money, and now she's effectively the leader of the DA. I don't know what's John Steenhuisen's job. John Steenhuisen is like a chief whip now, and Helen is the leader of the party. So for the opposition parties, Adriaan, to come to a question, the smaller opposition parties to have an impact, they need to mind the fact that renewal is key, and they need to build parties that can live beyond them as personalities.
And it was interesting to see, I think that's probably the biggest challenge to Herman Mashaba in Action SA. He's become a bit of a cult figure, and he's now brought in another big man from the Eastern Cape as his leader there, instead of building from ground up. I want to go to our readers and viewers' questions. We've been talking so much that we're running out of time. Jakkie, this one is specifically addressed to you from Philip Lawrence. Philip says he's making a statement, but I think it's a question to you as well. The current political trajectory simply points to a scenario where the ANC loses power to a coalition comprising mostly like-minded political groupings, although, and by all indications, the radical left may again play a so-called kingmaker role. If the ANC sides with the radical left in or after the 2024 election, South Africa will go over the proverbial cliff within a year and with catastrophic consequences. So I guess he's referring to a ANC-EFF matchup. That being said, Philip says, the majority of South Africans have no problem with coexistence and unity and will probably prevail and pull us through. Can Jakkie respond?
Well, I think that in the scenarios, I refer to that as where the ANC decides to, let's call it, go the RET faction eventually, because what is important to understand is, in my view, is that the support base is increasingly urban, it's increasingly better educated, while the ANC, and born free, and the ANC support base is increasingly rural, traditionalist. And if the party does not reinvent itself, if it does not start to look towards the future in terms of economic and thinking, it becomes a relic of the past. And this is the challenge. I wrote about this in Fate of the Nation years ago. This is really the essential challenge that the party faces, because its alliance across South Africa is really an alliance that includes former homeland leaders, traditional leaders, and so on. That traditionalist faction, which is bigger and more important than simply the RET faction, it's a choice between that traditionalist faction and the reformist faction that will determine the future of the ANC. And Ramaphosa's challenge is to move it from that traditionalist orientation under Jacob Zuma to a party of the future. And that, I think, is the one factor. The second is that I don't think any party is within striking distance of being able to equate the support levels of the ANC, the data. So the attraction of being in power, is huge, particularly for a party like the DA and even the EFF and Action SA, who on their own very, very unlikely to be able to grow their support base to challenge the power of the ANC. The ANC, to a large degree, will be able to make a choice, I think, upon whom it partners with. And that choice, which will first happen in Gauteng in 2024, and then in 2029 will happen nationally. That pathway will determine, I think, South Africa's pathway. So to a degree, what happens in the ANC, I still think remains, unfortunately, very important for South Africa.
Lindiwe, I want to pose this question to you, and it links very much to the President's Sena speech of the other night. It's from Henry. Henry asks, it seems as if the President has embarked on a slightly adjusted economic route in his Sena, with a larger emphasis on the role of the private sector in growing the economy and creating jobs, and an admission that government should provide the environment that would enable the private sector to do just that. Could it be that he has in mind to have South Africa on a better economic growth and job creation path by 2024 election, and thereby boost the ANC support?
Yeah, thanks, Adriaan. Before I answer that question, I want to defend my organization. Futurelect, Adriaan, is not a stalking horse for my political ambitions.
I was teasing you.
If I have any, the first thing I will do is send my resignation to the board. The two interests are completely separate from one another. Has President Ramaphosa changed trajectory? I think the president's taking advantage of a crisis to put his own identity on this government. The centralization of power, Mbeki style, and the open admission that the private sector is the main driver of economic growth, very much at odds with the developmental state framework, which is very much at the center of the ANC's stated policy, if not necessarily its enacted policy, I think is a personal stamp of individual conscience, as opposed to a shift in the party's direction. I also think it's an election campaign statement about 2022. Remember, in this country, presidents run for an electorate of a few thousand, not a few million. And so the audience is actually his party. This is how I will take us forward out of this economic crisis, and growth and developmental state can sort of work together. So yeah, I think he's taking advantage of a crisis. I'm glad he is. I'm still one of the few people who's cheering for President Ramaphosa. I understand the complexity with which he is operating, dragging this corpse of a political party with him through every stage of his decision-making in government, dragging a bloated cabinet of people he can't fire because they're also his chairman in the party or his SG or his deputy, whatever, while trying to make things happen. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that he set up a parallel cabinet in his own office, but it's not going to work. It's not sufficient for the structural change that South Africa needs. So his party is his own albatross. South Africa needs a president who's not shackled in the way that he is, and who doesn't have to send dog whistles and sort of secret messages in his Sona speech in order to get people enthused about his agenda. I mean, I say this again and again. I'm sick of saying it. South Africa is replete with solutions. We're drowning in solutions. We have multiple solutions that we can choose from. Some of the solutions that are at odds with one another have equal chances of success. We lack leadership, not solutions, and not leadership in terms of the competence to do the job. We have plenty of that. But we lack in our democratic structure a way for leaders to be able to govern effectively without being constrained by internal party politics, which may run counter to and at odds with their own agenda. And, the swearing oath to the Constitution and the law is supposed to achieve that, where you choose your country over your party. But as you know, there are many other things to think about, including safety, the patronage networks that have been left behind, et cetera, et cetera. And these things get complex. So I think President Ramaphosa should fall to his shoulders. But that should not be the responsibility of the state president, the head of government. Their job is to turn around this country, not to worry about an audience of a few thousand in their party.
Lindiwe, I want to ask you in 1 minute, if possible, just to quickly give us an update on the status of independent candidates. There's a lot of questions coming through. The Constitutional Court ruled in 2020 that Parliament has to give effect, has to change the Electoral Act to make it possible for independents to run in the national and provincial elections. Why is this process stalling? We heard Musi talking about it yesterday. In your view, will this have an impact on the 2024 result in a meaningful way?
I do, in terms of the who. I don't think we're going to get many independent candidates, but I think if we get as little as 10, 15 or 20, they could supplant the smaller opposition parties as a coalition option for the ruling party. Let me say, I'm going to say something that's been said again and again, but turkeys don't traditionally vote for Christmas. And that's really what the Constitutional Court is asking Parliament to do. It's asking party whips to tell their members to vote to take power away from themselves. And they're obviously going to push back against that. Cabinet tabled the lesser of the two proposals that came out of the Ministerial Committee on Electoral Reform. The majority proposal was for single-member electorates based on direct election. In other words, Joburg is divided into a series of districts. I stand in a municipality, in a district, an ANC candidate stands in a district, a DA, blah, 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 and the voters choose head-to-head against us as individuals. One is an independent, one is a party representative, etc. Mpumelelo does the same in a district in Cape Town, etc., etc. And whoever gets 50% plus one, they occupy half the seats in Parliament. The other half of seats in Parliament are then occupied by people who come from PR lists. That's what the proposal from the Ministerial Committee was. Single member, direct election, constituency representation. That would give equal status to independent candidates and party candidates. It would also still enable independent candidates to run under some form of umbrella in the PR system. Cabinet has rejected that in favor of a convoluted, difficult to understand multi-member system with fractions and things that don't carry over and lots of maths and arithmetic that is going to be impossible to communicate and even more difficult to manage at the ballot. Let me say, by the way, at my last, voting station, I had people like elbowing me. What am I supposed to do? Why have I got two ballots? Right? So the PR and ward system is complex in itself, but all we need to do is replicate that at national. We don't need to do anything more complicated than that. But of course, government has chosen the more difficult path in the hopes that it will curtail the opportunities for independent candidates to be successful. I don't think that'll pass constitutional muster. Yeah. I think any good state legal advisor would say you can't create a system where independent candidates are objectively disadvantaged because the parties are able to field as parties in a direct system. So we'll see what comes out of that. But whatever the system, it has to exist by 2024. And I think there will be a few already famous people who will use their public profile and leverage it to win a seat and are capable of beating party candidates, even in a multi-member list system. Sadly, I don't think under the current form, it's going to give us the change we deserve.
An important and I think underreported story. Colleagues, we ran out of time. We didn't speak about the EFF much. It seems like they've hit a bit of a ceiling in last year's election. Jakkie puts them again at around 9-10%. Mpumelelo, I do want to just ask you to answer this last question, which came through a number of times. Will the ANC accept the outcome of the election if they go under 50%? There's people in our chat box who's talking about a ZANU-PF type scenario where the ruling party does not accept defeat. If you have to predict on what you've seen just in a few seconds, what would be your response to that? Just unmute, Mpumi. Thank you.
Very quickly, Adriaan, there is no evidence at this stage that the ANC won't accept electoral defeat. And I think if you look at their losses in the metros over the years, and when they lost the city of Cape Town and the province, there was no upheaval. And when they lost Johannesburg and Tshwane, there was no upheaval. So based on what we know now, there is no evidence. However, there is suspicion, given the July unrest, given the holding of hostage of cabinet ministers by MKMVA and all those type of things that give people a feeling that something like that might happen. However, I doubt they would do that because that could actually eventually throw them to be a fringe party. South Africans would hate them. They won't forgive them for that. So at this stage, there's no evidence that they will do it.
Sorry, Adriaan, can I also add, the bigger danger is what happens if an opposition coalition makes an international government and the vestiges of ANC infighting reside within the security apparatus, the very vestiges that led to the July unrest. I want you to imagine a government that is afraid of its own security services because the security services are populated by people who are loyal to a party that no longer governs or factions that no longer govern. If the president, who's the president of the party, can't even get that under control, how much more difficult for opposition party. So I think there's definitely a security threat baked into that possibly.
With that comfort you've given us to sleep well tonight, Lindiwe, thank you very, very much. I want to thank all my panelists, Jakkie, Cilliers, Mpumelelo Mkhabela, Lindiwe, Mazibuko. Thank you so much for joining us, colleagues. As I said earlier, Jackie's entire paper is available on the ISS website. The link is in the Q&A chat box. Please look for it there, read the paper, engage with us. We definitely will come back because there's much more questions to be answered. Thank you for joining us. Follow this discussion on News 24 and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.